Good morning. I'm just going to continue with my series on the 2018 World Chess Championship between Fabiano Caruana and Magnus Carlsen. If we remember, the main match was the first one where no games were won. All 12 games, it was just a 12-game match in this period of time. All 12 games were drawn. They were far from being boring games. They were actually exciting games, and both players really tried to go for it. But it was the highest standard of chess ever in a World Championship match. Engine analysis showed all the 12 games to be up in the high 90s accuracy overall. There was a couple of chances, one for each player, which were both somewhere between difficult and impossible engine chances that neither of them managed to find. So they went to a rapid play playoff and best of 4 games. Magnus has won the first 2 and we're now in the third game. If Magnus gets a draw, that's it over. Fabi can't catch him, so Fabi has got to play for a win, and he's got to play for a win with the black pieces. And let's see how that goes. So Magnus plays e4, of course, best by test, and Fabi plays c5. Now Fabi plays normally e5, and he plays the Petros defense. Super solid, super reliable, but it's a drawish opening. Your idea is if you try to win, I'll win anyway. If you don't try to win, I'll get a draw because it's such a dry and symmetrical position. Obviously, that doesn't suit Fabiano today. He's got to play for a win, as he goes for a Sicilian. It's not like he doesn't know how to play the Sicilian. It's not like he's never played it. It's just not his favourite. So Magnus plays a normal open Sicilian, and this is the Sicilian French defence. And this is the French defence Steiner variation. Taking more space in the centre. You could look at it as being like a Sicilian where White has already established the Maroczy bind. So the knight comes to c6. You'll see the name of the opening has changed again. It's the Kramnik variation. So it goes through a few changes before it settles down. But no, after the pawn is taken, it's the Sicilian Taimanov variation. The Taimanov variation is like a Sicilian, where like an open Sicilian, where black then plays e6, and that's what characterizes the Taimanov variation. And it would have been the Taimanov variation from the start had he played e6 earlier. It's a bit, irrelevant. I'll just mention something on the Taimanov variation, which started to mention it the other day and didn't quite finish the story. So when I played in the chess league in Coventry, there was 2 games where I played against the Taimanov variation, and I ended up with more time after the end of the because you got a 30-second increment. I ended up with more time after the game than I had before I started the game, and I used the same not very good variation actually. I aimed for an early e5, but it worked for me. I won both games. I managed to do all my thinking in my opponent's time, and by that way gain a little bit of time. And as a joke, when I filled in my score sheet, made my notes on it, I scraved Taimanov EPR variation, Einstein, Podolsky, Rosen, which is the name of an experiment, which is actually to do with entanglement, but one interpretation of the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen experiment is the same as Einstein-Rosen, and Einstein-Rosen is a thought experiment about wormholes, so a potential way of travelling in time. All that long, complicated explanation for something that wasn't actually so very funny, but that's the life of a chess nerd. Okay, and so the bishop goes back to c2. It looks maybe a bit out of place on c2, but it ends up playing an interesting and good role on c2. So the knight's developed to attack the pawn, and the knight's developed to defend the pawn. He castles, and the bishop comes out. Pawn comes to b6 to defend the bishop. I would be tempted just to take no and say I've got a better structure here than you have, but actually maybe not. So the bishop develops, and the bishop develops, and Magnus castles as well. Queen comes to e7, and queen comes to d2. They're both finished with developments here. There are some advantages and some disadvantages for both sides. I think maybe as it stands, being able to look forward at some point in time to playing d5, even though it might give you an isolated pawn, might be advantageous for black. The arrangement of the pieces for white is probably just a bit better, and he might be able to put some pressure on the d pawn in the long term. And I think if we look at the analysis, I'm going to guess it's going to be somewhere around 0. 0.07 for according to analysis. So a very, very even game. And this is one of the things about this game. Carlsen, only needing a draw, is perfectly happy to keep it even and make sure that there isn't anything very exciting that happens here. So the rook comes to a good central position, and the rook comes to a good central position. The knight comes to e5, puts some pressure on this pawn, the c pawn, and the bishop's taken, and now we've got that pawn structure, which I think might just slightly favour white, slightly. And now he chases away the knight, which comes to g6, and the queen comes to e3, so that there isn't any tricks with the rook being on the same file as the queen. But no, the queens are on the same file as one another, so there might be some tricks with that. If pawn advances one square, can't really advance two, he just takes it, he can't take back, well he can take back, but then he takes with the knight, and then knight takes here, knight or bishop takes, and knight or bishop takes, and then we're left with a very simplified situation, which is probably easier to take down a line which leads to a draw. Magnus begins the process of doubling his rooks, and this is to prevent the knight from coming to here, of course. And the rooks are doubled, and the queen comes to c7, defends the pawn from this angle where it's not now on the same line as white's queen, so there's no kind of tricks with that. And he solidifies his pawn chain, gives himself some Luft, Caruana, and he solidifies his pawns on the other side. You can see this is a really super solid structure from Fabiano. It's going to be really hard for him to break this down and find a win, which is Magnus's intention with this play. Fabi begins the process of doubling his rooks, and the bishop comes to the excellent f3 square, challenging for the long diagonal. And instead of doubling the rooks, he puts his rook on the same file as the queen. It's a wise choice. So the queen comes off the same file as the rook. He might be looking at playing his knight here and his knight here. And if he somehow manages to establish a pawn on d4, well, he's bound to have a better position. Carlsen just makes a small expansion, keeps the knight out of here if the bishop ever moves. And now he doubles up his rooks on the other file. You'll notice there's no open files on the board at the minute. There's two semi-open files. You could say white owns this semi-open file and black this. You say white owns it because he has more freedom in it and more places he can place his pieces. To keep the control of the semi-open file, else to keep his pieces there. Whereas black has control of this semi-open file. But there isn't much happening there, and it might be difficult to get something to happen. So he retreats his bishop. So to a square where it's 3 times defended instead of once defended. But also it means that he might at some point in time be able to play e5 to break things open. The knight comes to c6. Maybe the plan of coming here is nearer. And a little bit of expansion from Carlsen on the king side. But everything is still solid. So the queen comes to a5 to attack the a2 pawn. The knight comes to a4. Actually, a really terrible spot for the knight. But it's like saying, yeah, well, what's your queen doing there? And Fabi agrees and moves the queen. Now, Magnus could have just gone back with his knight. And then it might just peter out in a repetition draw. Queen here, knight here, queen here, knight, and so on. But of course, Fabi is not going to go for that, because he is forced to play for a win. But also, if this swaps off and they swap off a pair of rooks, then this pawn will eventually drop and he'll get his pawn back. So he takes with the e-pawn, and the knight takes the pawn, threatening the rook. A pair of rooks are swapped off, another pair of rooks are swapped off. And now, if he takes the pawn here, Fabiano, then Magnus will take the bishop, the queen will have to retake, and the queen will take the pawn. So the pawn is at the moment safe. So he plays rook, bishop to a8 to threaten this pawn. So Magnus takes. Queen takes, and the knight comes to d7. He's looking for another swap. He'd be very happy if this swaps off. You might think, yeah, but then he plays here and gets one of these two pieces. He does, but then Magnus would play here check and get the bishop on a8 at the same time. This is more or less what happens. It just happens in a different way. So he plays queen to d6. Obviously now he's threatening to directly go queen to f8 and then win the rook. So the knight is taken on d7, and it's taken, and the queen takes c2. The queen comes to e8, the king comes to h7, and the queen takes the bishop on a8. So they're queen and knight against queen and bishop. In theory, this is a slight advantage for the player with the knight, because the knight and queen coordinate better than a knight and bishop, and both pieces can cover squares of both colours. The bishop can only cover squares of one colour. But in this situation where it's 3 against 1 against 4 against 2, they both got passed pawns, but it's fairly easy for Magnus. If he wins this pawn, he's got 3 passed pawns suddenly. So it's easy for him to play. So queen comes to d1 check, king comes to h2. Queen comes to d6 check. Magnus can happily go back and forward. This gives up a perpetual check. He can force a draw here, Fabi, but of course that's no good to him. So he backs up, and the knight comes. He's got to try something. He's got to try to find a win somewhere, but there isn't one. The queen gets in onto an absolutely ideal square on e5. Pawn comes to f5 to block the check, and it gets taken, and it gets taken, and now the queen comes to another very good, not quite ideal square. The ideal square was indeed e4, but Fabi makes sure he can't stay there. Knight comes to e6, and he advances the pawn, because the queen can't take, because the knight would be lost. So the knight comes here, so that he is threatening to take the pawn, and Magnus gets an advance of the pawn, and now his passed pawn is very, very near to being a queen. Queen comes to f6, and the pawn comes to c6, covered by the bishop. The knight comes to e6, so that's covering the c7 square. And he advances the a pawn. He's looking to play a5, swap off, and get a pair of passed pawns. Pawn comes to c7, and the queen attacks the knight immediately. Knight comes back to e6, and the queen comes in first to paralyze the knight before doing this idea. Queen comes to a1 check, and the king comes out. Obviously, he can't take the pawn, or the knight disappears. The knight comes to d4, and He advances the pawn to c7 now. Not possible to stop it being a queen, but c3 means that it can get taken immediately if it does become a queen. c5, no, can't stop it becoming a queen, and he offers a queen swap. Obviously, it's gone now for Fabi. He tried to hold, tried to win in a clearly drawn position, and it didn't go great for him. Carlsen gets a second queen. He could have actually just played queen here, check, and given up the queen for the knight and played on with the extra bishop. But he's a bit more sensible. He plays queen to g4. Then there's no threats for white whatsoever. For black whatsoever. And here Fabi resigns and Magnus retains his world championship in what was a really, really close match, full of draws, but far from being a boring match. It was actually a really exciting, close fought, brilliant match from both players. Both players played brilliantly. We need to give credit to Fabi for his brilliant play in this, but yeah, Magnus was a little bit better in the rapid period. So yeah, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment and share. Thanks. Bye.